So welcome to Wax Digital's presentation this morning from me, Daniel Ball. I'm Business Development Director at Wax Digital and very pleased to see so many of you here this morning. And today we're going to be taking a look at what I've termed putting your money where your mind is. And it's really focused on just a very few key things, I guess, that impact our perceived value of goods and services, both as a buyer and as a seller, and how we can kind of apply some of that thinking to day-to-day procurement activity. So what our understanding of those levers can then tell us about and kind of help us to maximise the results from purchasing activities. So, let's get started. Taking first of all, I suppose the concept of value. What do we mean by value? Well, it's defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as the material or monetary worth of something. And taking that simple definition, it should be pretty straightforward for us to be able to ascribe a commonly agreed and to a large extent a scientifically derived measure of value to pretty much any set of goods. So, you know, as seasoned procurement professionals, all of you, you'll be familiar with should cost modelling, no doubt, whereby if you research all of the materials, all of the labour costs, all of the overheads, the profit margin and so on and so forth that would apply to the manufacture of an item, you should be able to translate a list of baking ingredients into something approximating the cost of a cake. But value can, of course, be significantly affected by perception, which means ultimately that value can also be manipulated. So, value can be affected by genuine market forces of supply and demand. Take one of the ingredients from the cake mix we just saw. The discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in 1848 triggered one of the largest mass migrations in American history. So in 7 years you saw 300,000 fortune hunters go to California in the hope of finding gold, and San Francisco at that point in time became the fastest growing city in the world. The population went from 800 to over 20,000 in 2 years. Now, as you might well appreciate, that puts a bit of a strain on the resources of what actually was a very small town, not least of which is in areas such as food. So in order to suddenly go from feeding 800,000 people to 20,000 people on a daily basis, quite a difficult ask. So you got a real scarcity effect in things like eggs. So protein became in very short supply. Chicken eggs went from marginal value to about $1 a piece, which equates to something like $30 for each egg in today's money. The situation became so dire that grocery store owners were advertising for farmers to try and ship them eggs from around the country, but essentially you had a scarcity value which was applied to a commodity, which meant that its value actually as a price commodity rocketed. And the scramble for eggs, if you'll excuse the pun, drew entrepreneurs to an unusual source. So there was a set of small islands about 26 miles off the coast of California, known as the Farallon Islands. Now they're outcroppings of the continental shelf. They're pretty inhospitable, granite outcrops, and the local tribes actually called them the Islands of the Dead. But they've actually long been a sanctuary for mammals, for birds, for sea life. And one enterprising pharmacist by the name of Doc Robinson hatched a plan to profit off the egg shortage. So he and his brother-in-law sailed out to the Farallones and they raided those nesting grounds for all of the gulls. Unfortunately, they ran into some pretty bad weather on the way back, and they ended up losing about half of the eggs that they had collected. But they still pocketed over $3,000 from the sale of the remaining eggs that they'd collected on the Farallon Islands. That was the end of their journey as far as eggs were going. They decided that they weren't really cut out for the sea. But what they set in place was a chain reaction then, much like the gold rush, which saw eggers making their way out to the Farallon Islands to try and replicate their success. And in fact, such was the demand that actually rival factions sprang up and brawls broke out constantly between those rival gangs, culminating in stabbings and shootouts, and even on occasion piracy, where you'd see boats of eggers take on other boats and actually hijack their eggs. In total, about 14 million eggs were exported from the Faroe Islands, if you can call it an export, to San Francisco in the late 19th century, before, as you might expect, the collapse of the bird population on the Faroe Islands, and indeed the growth of local sources of supply, namely actual chickens, caught up with the demand, meant it was no longer viable economically to harvest from the islands. So with scarcity gone, value proposition disappeared with it. So first key principle, scarcity affects value significantly. So natural scarcity, as we've seen there, drives value. But returning to my earlier point about manipulation, those value accelerating dynamics can also be manufactured. So one of the great value manipulation tricks of the last century has been relieving young couples of pretty large chunks of their savings for something which, when looked at in purely economic terms, makes absolutely no value sense whatsoever. So in fact, diamonds lose about 50% of their value the moment that you walk out of the jeweller's. Yet the belief in their value and worth, you know, the measure in which they're prized, is completely unaffected by those actual economics. So how does that come about? Who have we got to thank for this? Not Don Draper, but actually one of his real-life equivalents, Gerald Lauk, who worked at the NWA advertising agency back in 1938 when De Beers approached the agency to help it put the brakes on the sliding value of diamonds. So consider the obstacles they faced. You know, if you equate diamonds to other kind of precious metals, which they tend to be bundled with, you look at things like gold and silver, they are tradable commodities. They are fungible, they are traded on the financial markets, you can hoard them, they will appreciate in value, you can hedge against losses in currencies and so on. Diamonds, however, don't have any of those qualities. The market for them is neither liquid nor are they fungible. You can't swap one big diamond for 10 small diamonds and vice versa. And to understand how illiquid a market it is, simply try and get a retail jeweller to buy back some diamond jewellery. They will not do it. And they won't do it because the offer they would make would be considered insultingly low. The markup on a diamond and its setting, as I say, ranges from about 100 to about 400%. So if the retailer bought the diamonds back from you, they would have to do so at wholesale price. And jewellers clearly don't want to do that because they're making you then an offer which would be deemed insulting and also might undercut the widely held notion that diamonds hold or even increase in value over time. So back to Don Draper. Not only diamonds are not an asset, but diamond engagement rings were a small and dying industry at the time in America and Europe. And with Europe on the verge of war at the time, it didn't seem like a very promising proposition to try and increase the sale of diamonds. But the market for engagement rings was 75% of De Beers' entire value sales. And if they were going to survive, let alone grow, they had to kind of reverse that declining trend. So, since young men buy over 90% of all engagement rings, what the marketers decided to do was to try and convince them that diamonds were a gift of love. And the larger and the finer the diamond, the greater the expression of love. And again, similarly, young women had to be encouraged to view diamonds as an integral part of the romantic courtship. So, racking their brains on how to sell diamonds that no one wanted, De Beers and Ayer began marketing diamonds as a symbol of status and love. They gave them to movie idols to use as symbols of their indestructible love. Society photographs were sent to magazines showing society figures getting diamonds. The link between diamonds and romance was very clearly established, stressing the size of the diamonds that people presented to one another as a maxim of the amounts that they actually loved one another. And that campaign was an immediate and stratospheric success. You know, within 3 years, and this is despite the Great Depression going on at the time, diamond sales in the US increased by about 55%. And 20 years later, an entire generation believes that an expensive diamond ring was a necessary step in the marriage process. Today, of course, over 80% of the women in Europe and the US receive diamond engagement rings when they get engaged. So we've created desire, created huge demand for an attractive product out of thin air. That's a value driver in itself, but to truly maximise value, we also have to demonstrate rarity or scarcity again, so back to our gull eggs. And in the early days of diamonds, they were indeed pretty rare. So in kind of the 1870s or so, you'd really only see them in a set of crown jewels or a Maharaja's necklace or something along those lines. But in 1870, there were huge deposits of diamonds discovered in South Africa, which threatened to collapse the price of diamonds as supplies flooded the market. So De Beers pulled their other masterstroke by carefully restricting the supply of diamonds for the last 150 years to maintain kind of the illusion of scarcity. They own all of the diamond mines, they buy all the diamonds from those mines that they don't own, and they then transfer all the diamonds over to the Central Selling Organisation, or CSO, which they also own, as it happens. The CSO sorts through the diamonds, puts them into boxes, presents them to the 250 or so partners that actually buy diamonds, and the price of the diamonds, the number of diamonds is completely non-negotiable. You either take it or leave it, and if you leave it, you're out of the diamond trade. So for most of the 20th century, that system has controlled 90% of the diamond trade and been solely responsible, really, for the inflated price of diamonds. So, to conclude on that point, very obvious that scarcity value, whether real or imagined, eggs or diamonds, and as a consequence desirability, can have a significant impact on the actual commercial value that we place on something. And by positioning a set of goods, or indeed an event, in such a way that the trade has to be done quickly, done now, or that opportunity is lost, we're able to manipulate the value proposition of a set of goods or services, or indeed a contract, as we'll come to. Now that urgency factor is another strong psychological lever which is aligned to scarcity, that's also used by sophisticated sales machines to help stimulate trade. So a really simple but nice example of this is something that forms part of the experience at this store. So this is the very first Aldi store, or Albrecht store as it was back then in 1913, before the brothers who took it over took it global. And Aldi has all sorts of ways of keeping prices low. I'm sure you'll be very familiar with some of them. You know, they have a comparatively tiny product range in comparison to most of their competitors, less than 10% of major supermarkets. They have almost all of their own brand goods, so obviously they control the manufacturing process, there's no middleman markup, and they have huge bulk buying power. Putting less air in packs means they can put more packs on a shelf and more packs in a pallet, and therefore more packs in a container or truck. Multitasking employees cover far more duties and mean lower overall staff numbers. And of course there's the infamous WTF aisle, as it's sometimes known, where they have all manner of weird and wonderful bin ends that are brought and sold at knockdown prices. But another psychological lever that the store uses is the Aldi panic, the fear that you cannot pack your goods quickly enough, which I'm sure if any of you have been to an Aldi, you'll have experienced. You know, you may have noticed actually that Aldi products have 4 barcodes, some of them, or they wrap the barcode around the entire product, as you can see here. That's in order to ensure that they can get those products through the checkout process as quickly as possible. Cashiers do not have to search for the barcode and waste any time doing that. So they process goods much more quickly, which is partially about obviously doing more work with fewer people, as I mentioned, but it also serves 2 other reasons. One, you've spent less time shopping, which you feel good about, but 2 is what's called, and actually a real term, the thrill at the till. So it's an adrenaline-based, it's a get the endorphins going shopping experience that underlines that the feeling that your trolley of goods has actually cost less, that you've paid nothing for extraneous fixtures and fittings and a calm shopping experience, and that all of that saving has come directly back to you as a consequence. So having that adrenaline, that thrill of getting things quickly through the till actually underlines the entire value proposition and makes you feel again that you're getting better value from them as a supplier. And then finally, we've seen desirability, we've seen scarcity, and we've seen urgency at the checkout. You know, 3 key factors in driving value. The last one I want to have a look at is competition. And this is really where it begins to kind of segue into technology. So if you'll bear with me, I'll get to the technology bit in a minute. In Holland, there's a place called Aalsmeer, and there's a wholesale auction house there, which is in a complex the size of Monaco. It is the world's largest building. And they process 12.5 billion plants a year here. So 30 million flowers every day go through this auction house. So there's no inherent scarcity here, but there is competition. And again, competition breeds fear of missing out. So like the Curry Mile in Manchester or the Jewellery Quarter in Birmingham, here we're creating a marketplace where buyers come because they know they can get the widest choice and they can fulfill all their requirements. But the payoff is that they have to compete against one another in real time to secure the goods. And this is where we get the Dutch auction model from. So the auction begins at 6 AM every day, and there's a 4-hour window to sell every single one of those 30 million stems. So you've got that urgency factor again. And what we have here is a scenario where there's a constantly rotating flow of goods and a huge rotating dial on the wall showing the start price of the current lot. That price then automatically reduces as the dial goes around, and whoever presses the button first gets the lot at that price. So the gamble is, do I wait and try and get it cheaper and risk losing it, or do I buy now to secure the goods and risk overpaying for those goods? So that confluence, the urgency, the competition, the fear of missing out, it's a very powerful driver to value, even amongst what is a very experienced buyer community of people who are undertaking this kind of buying activity day in, day out. So if we take some of those observations into the kind of activities that our clients are faced with daily, going to market to put in place contracts and make purchasing decisions across pretty much every category under the sun, even in a straightforward sourcing event, there are all sorts of questions and factors that can have a significant influence over the outcome and ultimately the value returned from any project. So things like not just how many suppliers we should invite, but how aware should we make those suppliers of one another during the course of an event? How visible should their position relative to one another be so that we are maximising competitive tension? And this may well even extend into letting suppliers know who the other parties in the process are, if by so doing you're confident that it will actually drive top-tier suppliers into competing against suppliers that are typically cheaper than them and competing on price against them. So disclosure about how many suppliers you've got in an event and who those suppliers are, it's not always right, but it's a factor to take into account when you're trying to drive best value in an event. And understanding whether actually by exposing cheaper suppliers to more expensive suppliers, that will drive down the cost of those more expensive suppliers. How long should the process take? And one of the great things about technology is the opportunity to shorten cycles, the potential to shorten cycles. And I'll come to a couple of extreme examples of that in a second. But equally, in a complex sourcing process, fatigue on both sides, on buyer and supplier side, is something to really guard against. It's one of the biggest dangers I think that we see. It's the diametric opposite to the thrill at the till experience, where actually suppliers and buyers going through a lengthy weeks, even months long tendering process actually get to the end and kind of just fall over the finish line rather than end up with a culmination of a really competitive environment. And that's something to be really careful about. And also things like how can you amplify competition by giving suppliers different bidding options in a way that means suppliers who can't necessarily be competitive overall can nonetheless challenge on parts of the overall process, so on individual subsets of that process. So going to market isn't just about selecting a few suppliers and inviting them to tender. It can be, obviously, but it shouldn't be. Factoring in market dynamics, factoring in buying levers that are viable to you strategically, psychologically, technologically, delivers far better outcomes. And from a technology standpoint, you can take this several steps further, kind of automating that process completely. So in the USA, for example, we see a very dynamic approach to spot buying, much more so actually than we see in Europe, where, for example, we work with a couple of major aerospace and defense companies, and they take the spot buying competitive tension concept really to the next level. So in these cases, we integrate sourcing with their MRP system. So every time a request is raised, essentially a purchase order, as would be in a normal system, instead of an order being placed on a supplier, that request automatically routes through to our system with the details of what's being bought, plus pre-qualified suppliers that are capable of delivering against that basket of goods and or services. Those suppliers are then all given the details of that request, and they have a limited period in which to provide a spot buy price against that basket of goods or services. And to give you some idea of the volumes involved, that equates to around 20,000 miniature tenders every month for just one of those clients. So you're putting all of those jigsaw pieces in place. You're bringing that short window of availability, the competitive tension, the fear of missing out hundreds of times every day to ultimately save this organisation tens of millions of dollars annually via a fully automated process for tendering what otherwise would just be something which went out as a purchase order. And then taking that one step further again, you can do the same sort of thing with auctions too, if you have the right framework set up. So here we have a print packaging client that utilises our Web3 system for supplier information management and onboarding. Operates in over 50 countries globally, and whilst not the biggest organisation in the world, only turn over about £300 million, they're very hot on supplier data management. And that's because they work for tier 1 pharma and financial services organisations, and the contracts that they have with their customers stipulate that any supplier that they use, wherever in the world that supplier might be, has to comply with their contracted standards to that particular customer. So every new supplier globally comes through our portal, and depending on what it is that they supply, they can answer up to 3,000 separate questions about their print production capabilities, about their insurances, their certifications, their accreditations, and so on and so forth. That data is then all automatically policed, and the suppliers are required to keep it up to date and accurate, and if they don't, the system will automatically put them on hold. So if they don't keep that information relevant and accurate and up to date, they will not get the opportunity to bid in for business from this client of ours. And that's an automated process. So all this detailed supplier data means that our customer has a bank of suppliers whose up-to-date capabilities they are very well versed on and who they can have great confidence in. So that when a print job comes in from Bayer or Procter & Gamble or whoever for 10,000 boxes of pharmaceuticals in Brazil, they have a number of readily pre-qualified suppliers that they can put that job out to, with absolute certainty that they meet not only the production requirements, but also the standards, again, the accreditations, the insurances, the certifications, and so on, that are required by each individual specific customer. And as a consequence, they run dozens of auctions every month, getting suppliers to bid against one another for each one of those print projects. So they can go from the kind of spot buys that we saw in A&D, but this time with added kind of real-time competition and again that thrill of the till. And in an industry with wafer-thin margins, I mean we're talking about kind of 2% margins in this kind of industry, that ability to be able to auction individual project lots has helped them to double in profitability over the last 3 years while also doubling the size of the business over that same period. So it's an extremely effective lever to value, but it requires all of those elements to be in place. So, using technology to deliver those value levers can be fantastically effective in all sorts of different scenarios. And we work with all sorts of fantastic companies to kind of help them get the most out of technology and to deliver the best possible results to their businesses in every imaginable purchasing scenario. And to finish, in some cases, that means ignoring all the levers I've illustrated over the last 20 minutes or so and challenging assumptions to deliver outcomes in a completely different way. So the final money where your mind thought is that I'd like to leave you today is kind of disrupts all that in a way that actually won a Nobel Prize for its originator, a guy called William VICKREY. You may or may not be familiar with VICKREY auctions, but VICKREY auctions get really to the heart of the matter in a pretty clever and very simple way by subtly forcing bidders to actually bid their true value for a lot. So again, it does it pretty simply by allowing each party to only bid once, so it's like a BAFO, if you will, but it awards the auction outcome not to the winner, but to the person or organisation that places second, which seems kind of counterintuitive, obviously. You know, surely I'm leaving money on the table if I'm awarding to the second-ranked bidder rather than the first-ranked bidder. I guess you'd think so, but quickly look at how it works. So, if we assume that you're buying, you as a buyer are convinced, given all the factors at play, and again that's the key issue here, how do we accelerate that value in the first place, that the true value of what you're looking to buy is £500. And of course it works the other way if we're talking reverse auctions. So remember, your true valuation is £500. Now consider the different scenarios you might play through. You could bid low at £300, but the risk is that your competition bids higher than you but lower than your valuation. So in that case, you'd have bought it for less than you thought it was worth, but instead you've lost it to somebody else and your competitor's got a massive bargain. Conversely, you might think about placing a higher bid. So, okay, I'm going to bid £700 because, well, I don't have to pay what I'm bidding. I only pay what the second place guy bids. So I'm prepared to bid £700. But obviously, if the second place bidder bids £600, you end up overpaying for what it is that you were prepared to buy at £500. So you'd be better off actually buying it for what you thought it was worth, or bidding what you thought it was worth, because then there's the opportunity for you to get a bargain. So I win, but I pay £400. And if you're outbid, then okay, somebody else gets it at your price, but at least you don't end up overpaying. So it's an extremely effective, if slightly counterintuitive, means of cutting right to the heart of the matter. And it's your job as a kind of a seller of a contract to create that desire, to create the urgency, the sense of competition in your suppliers. In other words, to kind of set the psychological value bar as high as possible. And a VICKREY auction tells you precisely how good a job you've done in doing that. So that's me. Thanks very much for your time this morning, everybody. If you'd like to find out any more about VICKREY auctions or the psychology of buying or selling, or indeed, of course, best source to pay solution at eWorld today, please do come and talk to us in the exhibition hall. Thank you very much for your time.